On behalf of the Principal, may I welcome you all to St Mary's College, whether you're students here, alumni of the college or visitors tonight. I'm Elizabeth Fisher, I'm President of St Mary's College Society, and tonight is the occasion of the second SMCS lecture, now an annual feature of our college life. May I add a special welcome to Professor Tom McLeish, sitting over there, who in reality needs no welcome here. He's been on our SCR for years. Tom is at home here. Professor McLeish was appointed to the chair of Natural Philosophy in the Department of Physics at York University a year ago. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society, the Institute of Physics and Royal Society of Chemistry. Before going to York, he was Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research here in Durham. Tom is a very distinguished theoretical physicist whose work, I am told, is renowned for increasing our understanding of the properties of soft matter. I say our understanding, but frankly, it's above my head. He has published both in technical sphere and on the relation of science and faith. In many ways, Tom is a successor to Bishop Grosseteste of Lincoln, the great medieval theologian-scientist, though without the mitre. As such, he was the obvious candidate to be invited to hold the chair of Professor of Natural Philosophy in the University of York Centre of Medieval Studies. There is, then, no one better qualified to talk on the rich entanglement of science and religion, Professor Paisel. Tom, SMCS, is very grateful for your readiness to come back tonight to give the second SMCS lecture. It's a real pleasure to welcome you, and we look forward to hearing you. Thank you, Tom.
I don't deserve any of those kind words. There were, however, only one word was true. That I would recognise as true. And that was the word home. So it's as if I had just walked out of St Mary's College yesterday. This community has been, for me, since I arrived in Durham 10 years ago for the first time, my ideal, I have to say, academic home. There is nothing else like St Mary's, and that's really the first thing I wanted to say. This is a wonderful place, and we are all very, very fortunate people to be here. Not, I have to say, in your case, to be listening to me. You understand what I'm saying? So the second thing I wanted to say tonight is a special thanks to Simon and Helen. So we'll all have received an email from Simon yesterday to say that he intends to stand down as principal at the end of this academic year after 8 terrific years. Both of them. I wanted to thank both of you because I know it's really you've both contributed to the community of this place. And have made the thing I just said about St Mary's become true. So thank you both very much. Thank you, Simon, particularly. And I'm sure that there's something very, very exciting around the corner. And sometimes you just have to say, I have to say, moving from Durham to York for me was a little bit of an experiment. I've had a tremendous time there. You'll see 2 cathedrals there. I honestly don't know which I prefer, but I spent 10 happy years of commuting from one to the other. I now just hop on a bike and cycle off to the University of York. Now, it's already 9:15. This is a bit late to start with. I'm not quite sure how we'll get. What I want to do is to, I hope, just, in the best of academic traditions, of academic community, think together and have some fun thinking with nice full tummies and a glass of wine, with Mike's port still, I'm aware, promised in the SCR afterwards. I'm staying in room 7. I don't mind how long into the night I talk with anyone over how many glasses or whatever there is upstairs. And I remember as an undergraduate talking about science and religion till goodness knows what hours. I don't think things have changed very much. Well, actually, things have changed a bit. Because what I want to do is to, I hope, just set us on a thinking path that recognises the rich and deep entanglement of these 2 deeply human impulses, science and religion, and not immediately to frame this as some form of media conflict, because that's what we're so often, always, encouraged to do. So I'm going to put the talk on one slide. Here's the talk on one slide, and then when you finish this slide, those of you interested in details can hear the rest of the talk. Those of you who aren't can, Facebook, whatever. There are books. I have completely failed to bring any books with me, and I have as a rule not to promote one's own books. However, there is a book. If you do want to read about this, there is a lovely book with OUP called Paper Wisdom in Science, which will take you a bit further. But this is what I want to say. The reason I got into all this was really because as a scientist, I have felt over my life increasingly awkward about, the cultural narrative of science, the stories people say around science. I believe, in fact, I kind of know in my bones, that science belongs in the same basket of deeply human activities and value-creating propensities in which live drama, storytelling, narrative, music, song, painting. All those things which we do, for me, science has always belonged with those, and therefore it's always been painful to me that for most people it doesn't. It belongs on a shelf. It belongs behind laboratory doors or on a clipboard, strange people with white coats, that sort of thing. Big Bang Theory. I mean, I don't mean the cosmological theory, I mean the American TV series. Scientists are not people you'd ever want to know. Are we? So in posh academic speak, science needs a positive cultural narrative. Actually, it needs it for other reasons. When the, potentially, possibly the most powerful nation on earth, is led by someone who can dismiss that nation's own world-leading scientific conclusions on climate at a flick of a finger, something is wrong, deeply wrong, with the public narrative of science. You see, science is in trouble. We need to think science religion because it's part of the trouble. Actually, going back across the Atlantic, one of the problems in the scientific narrative is, of course, this deeply weird entanglement between politics and religion, science, and that vicious triangle that goes on here. But let's not get too proud being this side of the Atlantic, because we have problems as well. So this is the issue. I want to explain why and illustrate why and how science is actually a very old and deeply human story. Now, the name is a problem, and we'll visit that in a little while. I think that we should take some deep drafts from some of our very ancient thinkers. We look into history and into philosophical history very much too often through the wrong end of a telescope. People writing 500, 1,000, even 2,000 or 3,000 years ago were, of course, every bit as intelligent and contemplative and wise as we are, perhaps wiser, and they certainly had, some of them, more time to think. That ought to give us pause for thought. So we're going to do a little bit of that. No one escapes. We're going to lock the doors until we have enjoyed the book of Job together. No, sorry, didn't realise you were going that way. That's going to happen. And we're going to do, and Elizabeth, I'm going to take up the challenge. Soft matter science. You will walk out of the doors today with a little glimpse into the softness of my molecular physical world, I hope. Now, how are we going to join this up together? I'm not quite sure. We'll see. But here's one thing I want to do. People talk, you see, about religion and science, or theology and science. And see, my experience is that I've been a scientist since I was about 2.5. You learn this early on, yeah. And I've been a Christian since my early adult life, I suppose. I couldn't say exactly when I could have said that for the first time. But you see, for me, these, as Grace and I were talking about earlier for dinner, we said, why is the problem? Why is it that people keep asking me, how do you reconcile your religion with your science? Why are you even asking the question? What's the reconciliation? I just don't get it. And I thought, well, what is the problem for people? Is it the theology? I know it's the theology. It's old-fashioned, it's fuddy-duddy, it's out of date, it's inflexible. Theology is just incapable of grasping the extraordinary intellectual achievements of the scientific world. And of course, what I could say, what I should say is then I came to Durham. Actually, it happened before I came to Durham, but actually might as well come to Durham, because as I'm sure you all know, Durham's theology department knocks the spots off every other theology department in the UK, every research exercise, which means, of course, that in spite of what the world rankings say, Durham theology department is obviously the best in the world. Of course, I mean, anyone who really knows things knows that. We can talk about that afterwards and why that is. And one of my great joys here as Pro Vice Chancellor of Research was popping in as often I could to the theology department here, because why wouldn't you go to the intellectual people of the world? Actually, I really enjoyed, just an aside, going to the different departments in Durham who were really, really good and working out why they were really, really good. And there's no single answer to that question. They all were really, really good in different ways. But one thing I learned about the theologians is that they were not inflexible, out of date, fuddy-duddy, stupid, hidebound, dogmatic, whatever. They were just brilliant and had intellectual tools that other disciplines didn't have. Wasn't that? Maybe it was the scientists. Maybe it's the Dawkins, and it's the it's the scientistic. It's the people. It's the myopic tunnel vision scientists who cannot see anything beyond their discipline. That's the problem, because they are there, but they represent a tiny minority of the discipline. Most scientists of any persuasion, deeply reflective people, deeply humble people who've experienced awe and wonder, because how could you not? And the numinous through science, and the sheer miracle that we're gifted somehow to construct in our minds the structure of atoms, the black holes colliding in distant galaxies. And I could go on, it's extraordinary and deeply. So that's not it. Then I realised the problem wasn't the theology, it wasn't the problem, it wasn't the science. The problem was the and. And of course, that's why it took me such a long time to realise the problem. Little words do sneaky things. Actually, the word just is even worse. Human beings are just. Well, Nancy knows all about this. She's the expert on calling out the word just. How wonderful to have, such global expertise right here. But of course, as soon as you say, I'm going to give a lecture on theology and science, or black and white, north and south, rich and poor, Christianity and Islam, what does the and do? It's not neutral. It does work. But like a sleight of hand magician, you don't notice what it's doing. It paints the white line down the middle of the football field and creates a dialectic. It creates an oppositional dialectic when it doesn't. Well, maybe that's not the right framing. Well, I'm going to try another frame. What we're going to get to, I hope by 9:35, is what I imagine is a theology of science. So what I want you to do tonight, whether you are would you say you're a religious person or not, or whoever you are, just step into a world where all things might be possible. And join me in a search for what I call a theology of science. All that really means is the answer to the question, what is the gift of science for? I'm unashamedly going to talk about purpose, because purpose is a human value by which we live. It doesn't have a very good profile in humanities departments today, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. But that's the question I'm going to. That's what I mean by theology of science, right? Okay, here we go. We're going to visit now. The first half is going to be what I call narrative clues. I call them narrative clues because I want to sound a little bit humanities-ish, but also because they're stories that people tell that will give us clues to our purpose. And we're going to call on many different disciplines. The first department we're going to go to is the departments of geography and social science. It's a project, there's a wonderful geographer I met and enjoyed working with very much for 5 years here in town, called Phil McLeish, who's now very well known in science and technology studies, now in Wageningen. And he and his team, Department of Geography, there you are, Underlying Narratives in European Publics on Science. That was the name of their summit. You can tell they're social scientists because they pluralise lots of words that we wouldn't pluralise. You know, public becomes publics, geography becomes geographies. Oh, I'm kidding, but you know, it's good. Oh, as a pro vice chancellor, you have to learn to speak the language. So I had to learn that if I said geographies rather than geography, they listen. Anyway, but the work was fabulous because what they'd done, they'd taken one of these scientifically difficult problems. You know, another temperature test for why science is in trouble publicly is when there's a difficult or tense scientific issue that needs public discussion. Climate change, burying nuclear waste, genetic medicine, nanotechnology, fracking. You know, we could go on down the list, couldn't we? How would you rate the quality of public debate around those issues? I would typically the debate crystallises into the for and the against very, very quickly, and it becomes intellectually banal. It doesn't. The grey areas aren't supported in the way that they should be. Gosh, that's what universities are for, aren't they? Exploring the grey areas. Hooray for grey. Hooray for not black and white. Hooray for things that we aren't sure about. Hooray for doubt. Anyway, so what these wonderful social geographers at Durham did was to explore the real narratives, the stories that were driving the statements underneath. They did, narrative analysis of public debate, focus groups, political statements, boom. And what they found, and this has been repeated in many, many scientists since then, is that although the ostensible political House of Commons Select Committee discussion might be about the evaluation of risk and hazard and reward, that's not the real driving narrative. The real stories are the fear and terror and gain that people see in harnessing this demon that they think is called science. These are narratives. But be careful what you wish for narrative. Unintended consequences. Pandora's box. Remember Pandora's daughter Zeus was given the jar. It's the Greek myth of where the troubles came from. She took the lid off the jar and all the troubles fell out, and once they're out, they can't get back in. So once you've invented, in other words, a nuclear weapon, you can't uninvent a nuclear weapon. Don't mess with nature. Nature is sacred. The Anthropocene is humans messing with nature that we didn't want to, would have left as it were. Of course, there isn't a square inch of the planet that isn't now changed as a amount. But nonetheless, science will keep us in the dark, and the rich will get richer and the poor get poorer. Now note, these narratives, the philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy called them the narratives of despair. They're all grim. There's not a single positive story about technology going on at all. Be careful what you wish for. Dupuy indicated as the old narrative desire, Pandora's box, the narrative of evil, messing with nature, the narrative of the sacred that we don't touch, kept in the dark, alienation, and the rich get rid of the Marxist narrative of exploitation. So I found this fascinating, not only because there was no positive narrative, but there was no theologically supported narrative. This is all pagan stuff. I mean, it's ancient, wonderful, good things in ancient pagan thought, as the medievalists said when they met Aristotle, as you know. But nonetheless, it's grim, and there's absolutely no voice of the church here, for example, in the public sphere. My point. The church, or churches, or religions, are on the back foot with respect to science. They don't think of it as positive, they think of it as some sort of threat. So in that position, it is not possible for them to inject any sort of constructive narrative around science. Okay, there we go. I suppose I might just earning brownie points by quoting Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour is a very interesting philosopher, actually, or anthropologist, really, isn't he? This is what he said recently. Everything happens if modernists were unable to reconcile their idea of science and nature. The alternative reality that connection of science and technology are more pressing every day, requiring even more intervention, more assemblies, more scrutiny, more stewardship. Latour has recently pointed out that neither the technological fix nor the return to nature are practical, open possibilities for us. We are where we are. We cannot go backwards. We have to go on. And he said an extraordinary thing recently. The real question is have the same type of patience and energy as God the Creator himself. Well, if Bruno Latour thinks that it would be helpful in our difficult social situation around science to explore theological categories, then I don't have to defend that myself, do I? We can just go ahead and do it. Now it is clue number 2. Here I am, as a scientist, suddenly deciding in my mid-career that I didn't know what science was for. And by that I don't mean, it's for discovering how the electron works, or making spaceships or better telephones. Of course we understand that sort of instrumental, it's fine, nothing wrong with it, good. But I wanted to know what science was for in terms of the human project. What deep urge does it satisfy? Where does it take us? And I had this question in the back of my mind for years and years, and so I read it around. And one of the people I enjoyed reading very much was George Steiner. I don't know if many of you are familiar with his wonder. I love his prose for a start. It's like frolicking the surf reading George Steiner. But he wrote one of his books. It's called Real Presences. And if you haven't read it, I do recommend it. It's 77 pages in Faber paperback. And it's a humanities scholars, a literary scholars' despairing cry at the loss of, in postmodern world, of meaning. The loss of contact between word and object, subject and object, between text and reference or world. It's the postmodern echo chamber that he most decries, and and the result of that, it's the secondary literature, it's the theses on theses on theses on Hamlet and so on. He had to say he looks to the sciences with rather rosy tinted spectacles. and Wilson Poon, a colleague, and I wrote a paper which basically said George is just as bad in the sciences as he is in the humanities. But he says this at one point about art, and I remember the first time I read this, it struck me between the eyes. Only art, he says, can go some way towards making accessible, towards waking into some measure of communicability the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. Now that's a complex, deep, and syntactically challenging sentence, but can you see what he's saying? It's the first I've read of it occurs very often in philosophy, particularly 20th century philosophy, the gap, the void, the existential difference, the human condition, as Hannah Arendt wrote it. We are the only animals that live as if we're fish out of water. Time doesn't suit us. It's either too slow or too fast. Nothing's ever right. It's too hot or too cold. We're ridiculously uncomfortable in this world of ours. And like all relationships, there's a sort of distance between the human and the non-human. Steiner gets this absolutely nails it and says this is what art is for. But can you imagine how I reacted to this as a scientist the first time I'd read it, seeking for a deep human action, actionable purpose of science? What could wake into communicability the inhuman others of matter more than science? Isn't this what science does? Now, this didn't answer my question, but it gave me a clue. Of course, it also might indicate us a way of thinking how art and science have very much more in common than we often think they might. But there's another clue. Real presences. Clue 3. Okay, it was about these two cultures. I don't want to visit this very often because it's so dull, but something awful happened in the 19th century. And everything got very fragmented. And from Wordsworth, who said that the day will come when the discoveries of the chemist, the biology, and the geologist will be no stranger to the poet than any other matter of his art now, providing that, this is the preface of the third edition to the Lyrical Ballads, providing that the metaphors of science become communally contemplative. But it didn't happen, which is why Keats says, famously, in the long poem Lamia, which none of us have ever read the whole poem, have we? But we all know this. I know. It's pages and pages. We all know this passage, cold philosophy, science will unweave the rainbow, as Dawkins took this as. And philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line. You know, the 19th century view that science denudes nature of wonder, awe and beauty. And therefore it is to be opposed by all that makes us human. Blake said, you know, I will not measure, I will imagine. I will, you know, in his rebuff of Newton. Soft matter science. Oh, I'm telling you about a project. Actually, this project started in Durham. Lovely. So one could be interdisciplinary in science, you know, as well. You want to be very interested. So physicists and biologists have an interesting time talking. And one of the most fun things that I ever did in Durham was to work with Martin Cannon and Edgar Pohl and people in biology and in physics around doing some physics with biological molecules. And one of the lovely things about introducing you to this system is that, having mentioned that Nancy Cartwright here in the front row is expert in any philosophy I might dare to tread on, David Dryden, also in the front row, is the person who conceived first in the history of humankind this physics I'm just about to tell you about in the mid-1980s. There. I'm getting Miriam back, David. There you go. So here's a mystery. This is a protein. Actually, it's not a protein. It's a picture of a protein. It's a very abstract representation of a protein molecule binding to DNA. Now, how do I make a little flashlight? There we go. And you can see that there are two little, if you look carefully, two little molecules here. This great big juggernaut thing will only bind to DNA. Oh, this happens in all of your cells now. It's happening now. If I raise my voice like this, you think you might have to run. There we go. You see the man jump. Sorry, but I didn't want to do that to you, sir. But the point is that in that very physical act, you just synthesized a million new molecules. And the reason you did, because there was a particular switch going on, is that processes like this happen. This only binds to the DNA to synthesize other molecules when these molecules bind there. Fine, okay. There was a theory for this, except that, of course, biologists have a rather structural, architectural view of the world. One of the glories of physics is that if we allow ourselves in our imagination to drink Alice in Wonderland's potion or eat the mushrooms, whatever it was that made us small. By the way, that's what we love Lewis Carroll, because scientists do this every day. The cosmologists drink the potion that makes them big and can swim in the galaxies, and the molecular scientists drink the potion that Alice drank. And obviously another Alice at the back of the room, by the way, who I do science with every day of the week. Alice is a great name for a scientist because you drink and you enter this small world. We do this in our imaginations every day of the week. And when we shrink 1,000 times, so that we can enter in our imagination the molecular world, what we see is this. Every single molecule in your bodies right now is executing a chaotic, random, unpredictable dance called Brownian motion. It's the motion we call heat. That is the molecular embodiment of heat. And cool things don't move very much, and hot things move a lot. And I realised, looking back on my extraordinarily short career as a scientist, is that there is a theme which links, it wasn't a deliberate theme, there's a theme that links all the things I've done, and that theme is this motion, this Brownian motion. And what David thought about in 1984, and that Rhoda Hawkins and I thought about in 2004, and then discovered that he'd beaten us to it by 30 years, or however, 20 years, was the question, how on earth do you send information through this molecule when it's dancing around in this weird way? It's like it's whispering in a noisy room. Suppose Nancy wanted to, given the couple there, we've separated or not separated, have a word with one of them, we've heard earlier, and wanted to whisper across the room, but all of us were talking. That, in a silent room, perhaps a message would get across, but not in this room. It's a mystery. I'm just fascinated by the way that biology manages to conquer the challenge of order being both arising and transmitted through chaos. And there's something about the chaos that's rather essential. You see, some of these random chaotic motions, things do go wrong. I mean, when DNA, because of Brownian motion, fails to duplicate properly, you can get cancer. There are wonderful correction mechanisms. You can get cancer. So maybe there's a downside to all this randomness and chaos. Well then, good news. Because we know that all this harmful, random, chaotic motion in the substrate of all reality is due to heat, we can turn it off. We can all jump into vats of liquid nitrogen and it'll all go away. There are companies in California that will sell you that they expect you to be dead before you do that, as you probably know, and it costs you hundreds of thousands of dollars. But you see what I mean? The only problem with that is that a non-chaotic biological organism, a still one, is a minus 200 degrees below centigrade one, i.e. a dead one. You've also, I don't know, have you seen that lovely experiment you do with liquid nitrogen? You take a rose and you dip the rose. Have you seen this in liquid nitrogen? You tap the rose with a hammer and it shatters like glass shards, like softness is not a property of the molecular structure, because if it were, the rose would be as soft at liquid nitrogen temperatures as it is at room temperature. No, softness is an emergent property of structure and dynamics. Chaotic, unpredictable, aleatoric, wild motion. We will revisit this. But first we have to thank you so much for introducing my medieval hero. Trumpets. Ta-da! Robert Grosseteste with mitre. No less. Before he got the mitre as Bishop of Lincoln in 1235, Grosseteste was master to this very interesting early movement in Oxford, this kind of rather weird-looking lot called the Franciscans, brand new, and he taught them the 7 liberal arts and theology and natural philosophy. And he also wrote in the early 1200s about light and colour and sound and motion and comets. And so this is not a talk for tonight, this is another time I would love to come back and tell you about the Durham University based, now Oxford and York as well, Ordered Universe project, which is now 10 years old. We didn't have a cake. And it happened here. We got medieval scholars and scientists to start working together over Grosseteste's extraordinary experimental and scientific works of the early 1200s. And we discovered that you needed to be a brilliant humanitarian scholar to understand the Latin and the philosophy he was writing with. But you needed to be a mathematical physicist to understand his mathematical logic. So you could only read these texts in an interdisciplinary group if you wanted to understand what was actually going on. He wrote about light, and he identified this lovely problem that classical atomism doesn't explain the rigidity of matter, but that if one supposed that light was somehow involved with the atoms of matter, one could explain this. The reason I'm going here is, by the way, part of the religion and science story that I was told when I was 15 is that before God said let Newton be and there was light, but there were these things called the Dark Ages, where the church oppressed all scientific learning and insisted on some dogmatic convergence towards teaching, irrespective of new ideas, novelty and observation. All I can say is that people who say that clearly haven't read anything of what these medieval centuries produced, because it's full of imagination, full of novelty, full of intellectual searching, full of freedom. They're perfectly happy reading Islamic and pagan scholars. It's an extraordinary open world that could teach us a thing or two about diversity. Not in every dimension. So anyway, text and stuff. Oh, and I did want you to... so we've had great fun You see, if you can translate medieval Latin into English, and you're happy with that, with all the difficulties translation might be, if it was a highly mathematical text, why not translate it into mathematics? Well, there's nothing wrong in that, is there? And when you've got the mathematics, you can compute with the mathematics. And so we've turned Grosseteste's brilliant physical instantiation of the early universe, the early medieval universe. He had a Big Bang theory, by the way, of the Aristotelian universe, the one with the Earth in the middle. He mathematically described how one could reconcile a biblical beginning of the universe using a metaphorical genesis. Thank you very much. He knows we have to do science ourselves. We don't find science in the Bible. We find an urge to do it there. We find the questions, not the answers. And we've been able to turn his De Luce, his theory of light, which is written in such accurate Latin that it's possible to translate that Latin into computable equations and do something that he would have wished he could have done, which is to do the sums and show that his light-filled universe, reflecting back from the firmament and recrystallizing the spheres, does indeed produce a universe with any number of celestial spheres you like, depending upon how transparent you make your universe. But, as I say, that's for another talk. All right. All I did want to say, there he is again, is he has this wonderful, when he's doing science, he doesn't really talk about why he's doing science, but he does it elsewhere. In his commentary on the posterior analytics, he tells us what's going on here. I'll read you this a little bit. Since sense perception, the weakest, that comes from Corinthians, of all human powers, apprehending only corruptible individual things survives, imagination stands, memory stands, and finally understanding, which is the noblest of human powers, capable of apprehending the incorruptible universal first essences, stands. Again, a complicated sentence, but I wanted you to read it. It is in translation, to realise that these natural philosophers from the great High Middle Ages, who lit the blue touch paper of science, having just recently discovered Aristotle, that illuminated the firework 3 centuries later that became the Renaissance, wouldn't have happened without them, had an explicit theological motivation for doing so. And they took seriously what in anthropological terms I described as this gap, this awkwardness, this ignorance we have of the world. They described it, of course, in theological terms, as a consequence of the fall, the biblical fall, and that when Adam and Eve disobeyed, not only did they lose the beauty of Eden, they also lost a deep insight into the workings of nature that God meant them to have as being beings like Him, but that through grace they could get this back by thinking and observing very hard. That's what this sort of means. Now, a little aside here on early modernism, as Peter Harrison, formerly of Oxford and now in Brisbane, has researched throughout much of his life, brilliant scholar, has brought to light Francis Bacon, the great philosopher of early modern science, essentially, although he doesn't admit it, buys this theology from the scholastics, hook, line, and more or less sinker. He says he's taking leave of Aristotle, but Francis Bacon's Nova Morgana apologium for doing experimental science is precisely this. It's recovering a human insight and understanding of the world that we once lost and need to refine one day. Breezing through, I can't possibly stand in Durham and not talk about Bede. We're going to go back. We're back in time, and we're going back. We're in our TARDIS. We're going back through the centuries. Bede wrote a wonderful book, as well as the first post-Roman history book, which I'm sure you all know. There's no one here who could possibly not have read the ecclesiastical history of the English-speaking peoples. But I'm not sure that everyone here has necessarily read De Rerum Naturae, even in the 2010 English translation of Faith Wallace. Did you know it took Bede's science till 2010 to be translated into English? Centuries after the first English-speaking translation of his geography and history. Anyway, it is a paragraph that I'm going to read it out, but among many other things, this is a fascinating book. He takes Pliny on and opposes him against his theory of why the sea is salty. There's one of the long-standing scientific problems of geography is why is the sea salty when the rivers are fresh and keep flowing into the sea. So the sea should get fresher and fresher, right? But it doesn't. and the Bede events the hydrological cycle. So this is great. Of course, you all know this place. And when I was Pro Vice Chancellor, I have to say one of my favourite walks was from the science site or from the Hill colleges to Palace Green or to the humanities departments on the Bailey, because the quickest walk is right through the cathedral. And I always used to walk right through the cathedral, and if I had 1 minute, I'd always go and say hello to Bede here. Those of you who saw a programme of the Sky Night, not the Sky Night, no, Songs of Praise. Songs of Praise at Epiphany last year wanted to do a theme on light, and filmed it in Durham. And they wanted to have a little bit of Bede and the Christmas star. And someone, unfortunately, said there's this guy McLeish, who I'm sure he can give you some scientific explanation for the Star of Bethlehem, right? And you can talk about Bede. So I said, yeah, I'll do that, but provided you let me talk about it on Bede's too, because I want to tell you about Bede, because Bede and light also go together. And so this was going to go out in January, but they filmed it in early December, 3 o'clock on a December afternoon, to get the thing in the can. Right? So you imagine where we're standing at the west end of the cathedral, in the Galilee Chapel. I'm standing right there with a camera behind me, looking towards Bede's poem about the morning star. And I'm talking about how Bede is obsessed with scientific metaphor for light and for God's light. And at the point at which I'm going to talk, this nice guy, what's his name? He's a nice man who uses Songs of Praise, very intelligent. I've really enjoyed working with these people. And the sun was low in the horizon on the west. It was a cloudy day. At the point at which I said, and for Bede, the greatest metaphor for Christ is the light. The clouds parting, and he couldn't have made it up. This sunbeam launched the west window, and just that whole golden painted prayer of his exploded in light. You want to go and grab the thing. I mean, you couldn't make it up. You really couldn't. But what impresses me about Bede a few times is that Bede could preach sermons assuming a knowledge of astronomy in the public that far exceeds public understanding of knowledge now. See, I love to ask why Bede's you see Bede's great metaphor for Christ is the morning star. Okay. And I love to ask people, okay, why did Bede's great prayer, that's the prayer that's on the wall, why does Bede call Christ the morning star? Because the Bible, well, he still does it. But why does he go for that? And some people say to me, what is the brightest star? Yeah, that's not important. What is the morning star? The morning star is Venus when it is west of the sun. In other words, when Venus rises before the sun. Venus is the planet next into the sun from us, and so its orbit is smaller than the Earth's orbit, so it's never far from the sun. Although Venus gets about, it's orbiting like that. It gets to about 45 degrees away from the sun at maximum elongation. So when Venus rises, you see, in the cold early morning, and the farmers are out in the fields or milking the thing, because in your farm you've got to go out well before dawn. And it's freezing cold. And it's black as midnight. And there is no glimmer of pink on the eastern horizon. But you see Venus. So for those who understand, they know that dawn is not far behind. That is why the morning star is for Bede the metaphor for Christ, because when you see Christ rising, you know that the new world is not far behind. Anyway, so I just wanted to illustrate that science as a metaphor for all things good has been part of this area of the woods for a long time. I just love this. Let's go back a bit further. 4th century, we're in patristics here, and Gregory of Nyssa, early church father. I learned about him when I was doing my late reader stuff. I just love these first 4 centuries. It took 400 years for some of the most brilliant minds in the Western and Eastern world to work out what this whole series of events around the resurrection and the early church and the life of Jesus was all about. And Gregory was one of them. But at any rate, what we should know, Gregory of Nyssa his brother was called Basil the Great. They were two of the church fathers. Fewer people than ought to know that the greatest of that family of all was their big sister, called Macrina. Right. Macrina was although she was a mother. So, no, you could say one of the great church fathers was actually a mother. She was a woman. Both Basil and Gregory called her the teacher, capital T. They were clearly loved to the bits, but were kind of terrified because she was brilliant. She knew all of philosophy. She'd read everything. She had a theological mind like a meat cleaver, and they would never write or publish or sermonize on anything they'd not run past my big sister first, because they knew if there was any wobbly point of logic, she'd slice it. She'd slice it straight away. So this lovely book called The Soul and the Resurrection, which you can find in translation just on the web, it's really recommend to you. Is little brother Gregory's account of his last conversation with his sister. And it's his last one because she's dying. She's very moving. She's dying in some pain. And this is so delightfully viciously gendered. I have to say, it's got to be true, because it could not possibly be true, because she's the woman doing the dying in pain. Little brother completely lost it. Absolutely distraught. So she helps him out of his grief over her dying in her last moments, by having an argument. So you should have an argument. Yeah. And let's argue about the reality of mind. Okay, or they call it psyche. So it's badly translated as soul. Psyche really should be translated as mind, because she says, look, let's debate whether mind is just an epiphenomenon of our material brains, or whether it's for real, whether we have real minds. And so they get to it, and she said, you, Gregory, you argue that mind is just an illusion, and I'll say it's real. Interesting, with artificial intelligence, we think these debates are new, but they're not so very new. There are, like I said, ancient sources of wisdom that I think can plug straight into some of our modern debates. What she's talking about here is her coup de grace. She says, look, I'll tell you why there's mind. Take a flask, an empty flask of air, or empty flask, and prove to yourself it's not empty by forcing it under some water, and see how the gush of water along the neck rushes in, and the water is checked by the strong current air, gurgling, bubbling against it. Because we have minds, we don't just rest on the perception of phenomena. We understand that beneath the invisible is the mentally visible presence of air. So we see the air with our minds that we can't see with our eyes. Therefore mind exists. Or we look at the moon. If we were just a passive mind, passive epiphenomenon, we would see a little sliver that grew to a half a penny and then a penny, and that's what we would think it was. But because we have a mind, we know it's a sphere, and the earth is a sphere, and the sun is lighting from this angle, and so we construct the orbit of the moon. So we have a mind. What Macrina says is that the clue that we have real independent conscious minds is that we do science. We see deeply under the surface of the perception of things. Okay. So this is, by the way, why I'm so thrilled that York has decided to call me a natural philosopher, not a scientist. Because one of the problems we have with science is that we wrap all this deep stuff up and we call it now, since 1834, knowledge. Science means knowledge, sciro, I know. It used to be called natural philosophy, which means when you unpack it, philosophia, I love wisdom, natura. I love wisdom to do with natural things. And I've gone to people for whom science is a real problem. It's what they were bad at school. They don't like it. They think and so just forget science. Suppose I asked you whether you'd like to be interested in wisdom to do with nature. Well, would that be more interesting to you? And I sometimes get a smile where I got a frown before. 5 minutes of my time is left. And we have enough time to visit. Not really. Okay, I'm going to do all this. We're going to go further back in time. And we're going to look at Job. We're going to jump straight into one of, for my mind, the greatest nature poem of ancient literature, and we don't know when this was written. The Book of Job is the Bible's version of a common ancient narrative, the suffering righteous person. It's a lot of dialogues with that lately, and Job knows he's innocent, and he's saying what so many suffering people say. It's interesting. If you know someone who's been chronically ill or badly suffering ill, the question is often not, the first question in their minds is often not, can we stop this? But why is this happening to me? And this is what Job is about. It's the why is this happening to me? It's so realistic. And he wants to meet God. He demands that he be vindicated of his maker. He gets crosser and crosser and crosser with God and his friends about the disorder of the world and about the immorality of his suffering. And then God finally speaks in his famous speech in Job 38. It's called the Lord's Answer. But the speech is not what we expect. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, says Yahweh? Where is the way to the abode of light, from whose womb comes the ice? Can you bind the Pleiades and loose the stars of Orion? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Then can you apply them to the earth? There are 168 questions about nature in the Lord's Answer. Well, that's not what we expected. And they're all about nature's wild side. And they're real questions. Why the Pleiades cluster together, the stars are around apart? Where does ice come from? How does water change from ice? How do birds know to navigate from the south? I mean, they are the questions of the disciplines that we now call geology and astronomy and meteorology and so on. Right? They're extraordinary. Now, where does this come from? Well, okay, it comes, the Lord's Answer is there. There's the structure of the book. William Blake illustrated the book beautifully, and you'll see as we jump through a few of his illustrations. And one of the reasons why I think we should look at Job is not only because that it contains the nature poem above all. And the very fact that it's written in question forms is significant. All the scientists here know that one of the reasons that we don't do a good job at school or in public explaining the groping, grasping, artistic, imaginative process of science is because what matters in science is not what you were taught at school, which is that the answers. You have to get the right answer. I have to apologise to new aspirant PhD students. I'm sorry. The reason you're here is because for 15 or 16 years you've been the best at finding the answers. And that's going to be absolutely no use. What you now have to do is to ask really imaginative questions. And no one ever helped you do that before, so God help you. I hope you will. But you see, that's why the Lord's Answer is so, well, as a scientist, I think, my goodness, what's this? What's it doing in ancient literature? So here are these speech cycles, and no wonder David Klein, who I first met right here in Durham, go and be a Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research at some decent research university. It sets you up for academic life. I was asked to introduce a meeting of the Society of Old Testament Studies who were meeting here in Durham. I got onto this thing of Job, and I knew that the world expert on Job was David Klein, who spent his year at the Journal of Old Testament Studies in Sheffield, working on Job. He just finished volume 3. And after I completely abused my position. After I finished my welcome to Durham, we're delighted to have you, and the Vice Chancellor on behalf of by the way, which one's David Klein? And I made the P-line for him, and the blessed guy let me translate his new translation of Job for the book I was writing. It was wonderful. Anyway, he says that. The point is, it's not just the Lord's Answer that's full of nature. That answers a nature trail that goes throughout the whole book. And the scholars that say that the Lord's Answer doesn't belong to Job because the questions of Job are moral and God's answers are all about some weird, just rain and hail and badgers. The point is the nature theme, the nature questions thread through the entire book. And what's more, the first cycle have earthy and inanimate things, the second cycle will go to animate objects, and the third cycle, when the arguments get tough, the whole of Hebrew cosmology is opened up. And this is the point. that Job does this Kantian thing. What Kant said, I see two things. I see the moral order within me and the cosmic order above me. Job does one thing, goes one step beyond Kant, and actually brings those two worlds together. And Job's accusation of God is that the world is chaotic, it's disordered, the wadi overflows, the snows thaw and the floods come, you can't even grow the crops, the lightning strikes and burns up the crops. You aren't in control of this crazy, wild world. So no surprise that you're out of control with my moral life. It's a double argument that's really the same argument. The moral world and the physical world they lie under the same accusation of wanton chaos. Moulding me like clay, pouring out, the lack of law embedded in nature. Okay, I'm going to go on briefly. And there's the cosmology, and it's such a twisted book. I can't help just drawing your attention to a text that's often that I will flick over. Like all theophanies, Job contains a theophany. Clouds veil God like they do for Moses and like they do for Elijah. But what the point about the Old Testament clouding of God is that we should see the Creator because our eyes can't bear it. In this twisted sense, he can't see out. It's a signal that this has got really twisted. When those arguments get to their highest point, a beautiful thing happens. A new voice sounds. It's not yet God's answer, but it's about a mind. And the reason I want to show you this is because it's known in County Durham as the Miner's Prayer. David Wilkinson told me that Easington Colliery Parish Church has Job 28 inscribed on its stained glass windows, and there was a time when every miner's son and daughter knew this passage in Job off by heart. It's called the Miner's Prayer. It's the only place in the Bible where miners are talked about, and talked about in the most extraordinary way. Here they are in the mine with iron and copper. They have a light, they put an end to darkness, and they, immigrants though they may be, foreign race, cut the shaft, they dangle and sway underground, and underneath they see rocks changed by fire. The lapis lazuli, the flecks of gold. The text goes on to say, not even a falcon with sharp eyes, not the king of Greece prowling above the surface, can see what the miners can see, which is the structure under the earth. You see where I'm going with this? Animal life as perception sees a surface. Humans see into the depth of things. For me, this poem is my favourite icon for what science does. If you want to see what science, I would say science is seeing beneath the surface of the world, into the structure, in a wonderful way our minds are able to do. It's what Grosseteste talked about, it's what McLeish talked about, and they got it, well, they knew it, but it's right there in this beautiful biblical passage, which incidentally, if you don't want to believe me, philosopher Susan Nyman, who's at the Einstein, she's a neo-Kantian, maybe you know Susan Nyman, Nancy, has written a wonderful essay recently, saying, for far as I'm aware, she's entitled to secular philosophy, neo-Kantian. She says that Western philosophy should recognise it stands on two textual foundations. One is Plato, the second is the Book of Job. And the sooner we recognise that, sorry, Susan Nyman says it, I don't need to defend this. So, after this passage, you have God himself. Finally, it's a search for wisdom. God sees into the depth of creation in the same way that the miners see. And it's absolutely wonderful. And people have even thought, well, perhaps the miners are really God. No, they're miners. They're really people. They really are people. So, winding up, in the Book of Job, this ancient source of wisdom, we have 6 different ways of looking at creation, at our relationship with nature, bizarrely. We have the friends of Job who say it's a retributive moral law. It will punish you, Job, if you've done evil. There's Bildad who says it's an eternal mystery. There's Zophar who says it's a book of nature, you can read it and it'll teach you things. There's Job who says it's no, just uncontrolled chaos to be terrified of. There's God who suggests that you might be worshipping nature, not me. Now, it doesn't take an awful amount of imagination to remember that those very negative, despairing narratives are circulating around science today, and we call them exploitation, alienations, the sacred, evil, and desire. That they map on one-to-one. And what we began this evening with, 40 minutes ago, was our requirement of another story. We needed a new narrative. But Job doesn't have 5 narratives, it has 6 narratives. And the final story is that our relationship, our questioning engagement with nature is our way to wisdom. And that's the point at which I wanted to leave us. Because through the historical survey and little thinky journey that we've taken tonight, and through just a little brief encounter with a timeless ancient text, I think we found a source and a resonance with people like Bede and Grosseteste and maybe others who in the history have glimpsed that the gift of science is actually part of this ancient search that lies at the heart of what our purpose is about, which is search for wisdom, philosophia. So that's why I very much hope that after tonight, none of us will be scientists, but we might all be natural philosophers. Now, enough for me. Thank you so much.
Absolutely fascinating. As a young postgraduate student, I remember reading, I think it was David Holbrook writing on philosophy of education, that the question at the end of physics is a metaphysical one. And it's a philosophy I tried to take into 34 years in education, but it was a bit undermined by more utilitarian approaches. And it was absolutely wonderful to revisit the wisdom of the ancients and to look at the whole long spectrum of religion and culture and how it affects real scientific inquiry, as opposed to just getting the right answers. So thank you for a wonderful and very, very stimulating lecture and questions, and please accept this as a token of the SMCS Committee's appreciation.
Thank you very much indeed. Oh, look, the mic's not here anymore, but it's this is very, very topical gin. But could I ever use this? But I can't make gin and tonic like mine.
No. We'll have to continue this, if not tonight, then some other time. It's got so much to talk about. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Right.
And good evening and a safe journey.
Simon straight away. Simon, there you go. That's straight away. Okay.
It's just so wonderful to see you again.
Thank you for pinning me to the wall. Oh my goodness.
It's just so much fun. So much together. And it's revisiting.
Yeah.
That's what's wrong with me, is that